I'm Todd Jones, recovering from 30 years as a sports writer. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with some of the best sports writers of our time, who knew the greatest athletes and coaches and experienced firsthand some of the biggest sports moments of the past half century. We'll share stories behind the stories, some we've only told each other. Pull up a seat on Press Box Access. Jerry Tipton covered University of Kentucky basketball as a beat reporter for 41 years. 41 years! Jerry was with the Wildcats, or as the faithful call them, the Cats, day after day, season after season, from 1981 until his retirement in July. First one in the media room, last one to leave. Jerry was always there, in the eye of the big blue hurricane, like a rock of journalistic integrity. He was never afraid to ask the hard questions. That didn't make Jerry popular with some fans, but he's a legend among his peers. 41 years covering the Cats. And somehow the Hall of Famer kept his sanity and sense of humor. Hey, Jerry, thanks for taking time from the grueling demands of your retirement to join us on Press Box Access.
Well, thank you, Todd. Yes, it's an interesting experience. I tell people I have never retired before, so I don't know exactly how to do this, but so far, so good.
Well, I know one thing about retirement. You're buying all the beer right now, right, for us.
Well, I'm actually, one of my objectives, I think I like to have objectives and goals and to be trying to achieve. And one of them is I'm trying to trim up and get in better shape. I don't know why exactly, one of my sons asked me. But so that's my goal. I've been working out and no alcohol. So we'll see.
Well, that doesn't mean you can't buy it for me, so, you know.
Well, yeah.
We first met, I think it was 1986, when I was a snot-nosed kid at the Colonel, the University of Kentucky student paper. And this was early in your legendary tenure as the beat reporter covering the University of Kentucky basketball for the Lexington Herald-Leader. You ended up carving out a Hall of Fame career, 41 years on the Kentucky beat until you retired on July 1st. Of 2022. 41 years, Jerry. When you reflect on that, what do you think about?
Well, it seems sort of unbelievable, to be honest with you. And in my farewell column, I pointed out that I kind of work and live in a bubble where I'm only thinking about the last one or two stories, usually second guessing what I've done, how it could have been better, and then thinking ahead one or two stories. But I'm sort of, it's kind of embarrassing, to be honest. I don't know why, but 41 years, and it is hard to wrap my head around. I know Adolph Rupp was the Kentucky coach for 42 years, so I didn't want to match him. He should be alone.
Yeah. Well, you covered more than 1,200 Kentucky games, 3 national championship teams, 9 different teams in all that went to the Final Four, 6 coaches. When you think about everything you covered in totality, how would you sum that up?
Well, I've always felt lucky, from day one to be covering something that, as you know, the readers are so intently interested in. And it was almost like when our circulation was however many thousand it was, I considered them all copy editors. They were looking at the stories almost word for word. And in a way that was good because it sort of at least kept me on my toes more so than they might have been otherwise. And like the journalism professors say, you shouldn't assume that. They sort of echoed that in their own way, the readers did, because they were checking facts and spelling and everything. And in a way that was good. It took some adjusting, but it was a good adjustment to make.
Well, when you think about it, you as a writer, you want to write for somebody that's passionate about the subject, right?
Absolutely. That's that was one of the many benefits of covering Kentucky. That you knew your stories were going to be read, and when if you happen to do a good story, maybe somebody around now in the age of the internet and so on. Somebody, people around the country or world, I suppose, could read the story. Mm-hmm. And so that's also a thing to keep you on your toes. But I felt very blessed to be writing about something people care about.
Right. Well, I mean, Rick Pitino once called it the Roman Empire of college basketball, Kentucky basketball. And, you know, you start out your own career. You were working in Huntington, West Virginia for several years, right? You were doing Marshall basketball and Ohio and West Virginia high schools. And I think you were even a bowling writer. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Well, you learned how to write about bowling, and you did a Sunday bowling column. I'm fixated on this because I'm fascinated. Was there recruiting in bowling?
Well, bowling was like a world unto itself.
Yes.
And the people that bowled and read the bowling column were into it. I don't know what percentage of the total readers fit that description, but the ones that did were into it. It wasn't recreation. It was more than that. And so anyway, that was the first, that was kind of my introduction into how journalism can lead to controversy because...
Really?
If you bowled, I went around there were 3 bowling houses in Huntington and 1 in Ashland, Kentucky. And I had to go around on Friday morning and get the scores for the week. And then I would come back to the office and type up, everybody had a 200 game and a 600 series or higher, if I remember. And so that was the agate that went along with the bowling column. And I always went to this one bowling house, Ted Ned's Pro Bowl.
Yes.
I went there last. That was in Huntington. And I would get lunch there because now it was late morning, and they had a great tuna sandwich. So I would get a tuna sandwich. And if the owner, it usually was Ted, if he was there, he would insist on paying for the sandwich. And looking back on it now, I should not have done that.
Right.
I didn't know better. So anyway, to get to the chase, if you bowled a really good score in a game or a series, the local bowling secretary, for lack of a better word, would come around to the alley, to the bowling house, make sure everything was right, make sure it happened, make sure the conditions were right, there was nothing, no cheating. And then if everything was fine, the secretary would send something to the national bowling office, and the national office, would send you, the bowler, a certificate recognizing, acknowledging your great game. So anyway, the secretary went to Ted Ned's, and they saw that the lanes were not oiled correctly. You oil the lanes so there's less friction on the ball rolling across the wood. And if you could oil them in a way where the ball was more likely to go into the pocket, and you'd have a better score.
Right.
So he did not report this big score. It wasn't legit. So I wrote about that, and I also compared like averages. All the houses would post on their walls everybody's big average, and so I compared to the houses, and Ted Ned's had higher scores.
Oh, scandal.
You draw whatever conclusion you want to draw.
Whoa.
And so I wrote it, and it caused a controversy, and they had a big meeting.
Oh, yeah.
And the sports editor and me and bowling officials and Ted Ned were at this meeting, and the only thing I'm thinking about is, was it accurate?
Right.
That was, everything else is out of my area.
Right.
And nobody ever questioned the accuracy of what I wrote. I talked to the secretary. I didn't make it up. And so anyway, all they talked about was basically, you shouldn't have written it.
Oh, yeah, right.
Say it was right or wrong. I just shouldn't have done it. It wasn't good.
You should have been on the team, Jerry.
Right, exactly. So it ends, and I go up to Ted afterwards and tell him, just so you know, there was nothing personal involved. I was just doing my job. And he said he didn't believe that, especially after all the tuna fish sandwiches he bought me. So now I felt bad.
Compromised.
And dumb. So I got some money. I reached in my pocket, and it wasn't much more than like $10. Back then, $10 could get you several tuna fish sandwiches. And he was embarrassed that I was giving him $10 to square it. And I learned about don't take things.
Exactly.
Like that. It may seem totally innocent, which it did. it didn't cross my mind that I was being bribed.
Well, it sounds like it was good training for what you had to deal with. But so you learned a lot about journalism, covering Marshall basketball and other things. And then you show up in Lexington, Kentucky in 1981 to cover Kentucky basketball and football at the time, by the way. At what point did you realize you were dealing with a different beast that is Kentucky basketball?
Well, I mean, I learned I started with football. I mean, that was the start of the school year. So I did football and then basketball. And in 1981, Fran Kersey was the coach. And I was a total innocent, And I didn't realize, but I came to realize that he was on the hot seat. And so if they didn't have a good season, which was not likely, he might get fired. So he wasn't in the best of moods. And so this was kind of baptism by fire. And, I was just trying to learn. And I think the new guy can be pretty easy to pick on. Yeah. So I got picked on some. And I remember, if you remember D.G. Fitzmaurice, he was the columnist at the Herald-Leader at the time. And he was a great guy. I was in a city of strangers. And he befriended me and helped me. And I remember he introduced me to Fran Kersey right at the start. And Fran almost immediately asked me, what sport did I like better, football or basketball? And so nowadays I would say football just for political reasons. But back then I was trying to be honest without being too honest. So I just said I like both, which was more or less true. Right. That was not the right answer. He wanted football as the answer. Yeah. So whatever chance I had for a smooth takeaway on the Kentucky beat, I think died that day.
Well, then you head into basketball season, and Kentucky basketball. I'm a native of Kentucky, a graduate of the University of Kentucky. I feel like I understand where the folks are coming from, the fans. It probably is the most passionate fan base, certainly in college sports.
Well, as you know, they're into it. And there's sort of a reverence, I think they have for Kentucky basketball. And as you know, newsrooms, that's where irreverence reigns.
Right.
Yeah. Ideally, anyway. There's no reverence. You're trying to cover something objectively.
Right.
And you can't do that if you have reverence for it. So anyway, there's kind of a built-in chance for conflict, I would say. And my favorite story along those lines was if you remember Street and Smith magazine, it was, to me, the preseason magazine back then.
Right.
And one year, and I think, I can't remember, I guess, I don't know if I was looking for a story or the Sunday Notes column, but anyway, in their preseason magazine, this was in the early 80s, they had Kentucky number 2 in their preseason top 25. So
what?
I was going to call Jim O'Brien, the editor, and just do a note.
Right.
And my thought was, how much he likes Kentucky. He must really like Kentucky, number 2 in the country. So I get him, and we talk. What do you like about Kentucky? He says, oh, yeah, they have really good guard play, and their big guys are elite. And, so I'm just kind of nodding, yeah, okay. I mean, that's, nothing surprising there. So then I thought, well, okay, what kind of feedback have you gotten from Kentucky fans? And he says, oh, they're really mad at me. They're really upset. And I said, really? Why? Why are they upset? He said, they're mad because how could you rate us so low? Number 2.
Wow.
Number 2 in the country. And I think that sums up, they see, and there are pro teams that I had that sort of feeling for, that they were different and, not just among the crowd. And as you know, that's how Kentucky fans see Kentucky. It's in a separate category. I like to say they see Kentucky as the Globetrotters. Everybody else is the Washington Generals. And that includes Duke, Carolina, Kansas, whoever you want to say.
But it didn't always make for an easy relationship with you and the fans, though, right?
Well, I tried to understand, and I tried to make it be a fun thing as much as I could. And after you might like this, I think I wrote about this, after they lost to St. Peter's in the tournament this year, I was thinking after I was done with the stories, boy, I bet I'll get an angry email or two. And the next morning, before we left Indianapolis to drive home, I was checking my mail and so on, and there was an email. And early on, it said, "I bet you're not going to read this all the way through." And I thought, uh-oh, here we go.
Yeah.
And so it was like a challenge. Oh, yeah? Okay, I will read it all the way through. It wasn't that long. But I noticed there were F-bombs in it. And more than once, F you at me. And so I read it a second time just to count the F-bombs. And there were 6. And so he didn't like a question I asked one of the players. I forget that the post-game press conference, you can watch it on social media or the internet.
Right.
And not that I wouldn't want that to make a difference. I'm just trying to do my job. But I'm not thinking, ooh, the fans might hear. So anyway, I wrote him back and told him that I would ask the sports editor and about my question. Did I ask it properly? Was it okay? Mm-hmm. And I also asked John Clay, one of our columnists, who was also in the post-game press conference, did I ask it okay? And they both said it was fine. And the guy wrote me back and apologized. And I think what the fans want is just some sort of acknowledgement, respect for their interest. Mm-hmm. And not, very early on, I might lash back, and that just fueled the fire. It just kind of works. So after that, I tried to be respectful no matter what. Right. And, that seemed to smooth the waters out.
During 40 years, was there ever a time where it just got to be too much, too negative for you? Or
not really. I mean, it's kind of the fun part of it, I think. It makes me feel like I'm doing my job, or I was doing my job.
Right.
That if everybody was just constantly applauding, I would wonder if I was doing being objective about what I was covering.
Right.
So I always felt like that if the reporter is doing his or her job and the coach is doing his or her job, or the fans, that there's a built-in friction there because there's different agendas. Mm-hmm. And I'm just trying to inform the reader as best I can or put things in perspective.
Right.
And, and for the most part, the coach is trying to win games. And sometimes being honest in what's going on might not be helpful in terms of winning.
Right. Well, let's think about the perspectives of that they all come together at certain times for almost like historic moments. And one of the times that I recall that I'm sure was a memory of your own was the 1983 Dream Game. And that's Louisville versus Kentucky, NCAA Mideast Regional, down in Knoxville of all places. And I think it was like the first time in 24 years that the schools had played. It was just such a huge deal in the state of Kentucky. You're at that game. Put us in the arena. What was the atmosphere like at that day?
Well, it was surreal. That would be the word I would use because Louisville had been lobbying publicly for start a series. In Kentucky, I think Kentucky, they cited a policy that wouldn't allow them to play Louisville in the regular season. Yeah. So I asked them for a copy of the policy. I wanted to read it. And I think it was an open records request. I can't remember for sure. But the answer was, well, there's not a written policy.
Oh, it's verbal.
It's a policy with quotation marks, I guess, around it. And okay. And I remember, I believe it was CBS interviewed Joby Hall, I think during the season. And one of their questions was playing Louisville, and he walked away. End of interview. And so it was that touchy of a subject. And so for them to be playing, of course, at the NCAA tournament, I don't care what, there's no policy there.
Right.
And they hadn't played since the 59 NCAA tournament. Mm-hmm. And so they played, I remember seeing the two teams. The governor, as you remember, wore a sport coat that was half blue and half red.
Yeah, right.
So he's staying neutral. And just to see the two teams on the court warming up for the game was unbelievable. It was like the Israelis and the Palestinians were going to play a basketball game. And, it just didn't seem like this was possible. Right. So anyway, they play. And, of course, Louisville wins in overtime. And, the so-called Dream Game. But it was such a great game, a memorable game, that the state legislature got involved, as you may remember, and the word got out that they were going to pass a law mandating Kentucky to play Louisville. Mm-hmm. And so they made an exception in the policy, and they played the next season, started a series, which continues to this day.
Right.
And they hadn't played I looked it up, they hadn't played this in the regular season since 1922.
Wow.
And so they played in 80, what would that be, 83, 84?
61 years, 62 years,
right.
Yeah.
So they played then, and it's been great. The fans are, they're always engaged, but they're really, really engaged for that.
But when you're at a game like that 83 game, Kentucky-Louisville, do you actually feel like you're at more than a basketball game?
Yes. You feel like every once in a while, you feel like you're witnessing history.
Yeah.
And that's, that was the feeling with that game.
Right.
That, that's something that's going to be remembered for a long, long time. Yeah, I felt privileged to be there. Some of those kind of stories I don't read. I don't read them because I'm afraid I failed to capture, the magnitude of what I just saw.
Well, you mentioned history, and obviously the game that people associate historically with Kentucky, besides the fact that they won all their national championships, they played in what many people consider the greatest college game ever, the 92 Duke game in the Eastern Finals of the NCAA tournament, Eastern Regional in Philadelphia, the Laettner game, right? The Laettner shot.
Right.
When you think about that game, do you remember what your feeling was when the game ended and you had to write?
I was overwhelmed. I felt inadequate to the task. I was just like, lost. What do I do? And I remember wondering, should I go to the formal press conferences with the coaches? And I guess they brought players. I think they did. Or go to the locker room. Mm. And nowadays, I went to the press conference and it was fine. I mean, it was what it was. But I wish I had gone to the locker room because I think the emotions were raw. And I think that would have been the place to be, to try to capture the emotional tidal wave that game was.
Why did it feel overwhelming? What was it about it?
It was just the magnitude of it. Duke's, I think they were number one, but they were the defending national champion. Kentucky, and I don't think I captured this very well, but this was the pinnacle of a 3-year rebuilding operation by Rick Pitino. He came in 89-90, as you know, and the program was on probation, no tournament in 90 and 91, and they got good. They had the best record in the SEC his second year, but they were ineligible to win the championship. So, but 91-92 was their first year back as eligible for the tournament, and they were Kentucky again. Mm. Kentucky was Kentucky, a contender to win the national championship. They played Duke, the defending champion. The game goes into overtime. They make a shot with 2.1 seconds left, and of course, you know the rest. But I remember one little thing that I'm proud of is that my seat was near, it was about the top of the key on the end of the court for the inbounds pass. Mm-hmm. And that Grant Hill threw, if I remember right. And I noticed that Kentucky did not guard the inbounder. They had two guys on Laettner. Unfortunately for Kentucky, they both played behind him. So he had an easy way to catch the ball, and they were both shorter than him. So there wasn't a big chore to turn. Mashburn had fouled out, Jamal Mashburn. And so it happened, right in my living room, so to speak. And I remember seeing Mike Krzyzewski go up to Cawood Ledford. It was Cawood Ledford's last game.
Yeah, legendary Kentucky announcer, right?
Legendary announcer, 39 years. And he was an icon. You talk about an icon. He was an icon. And I remember when Sean Woods made the shot with 2.1 seconds left, a bank straight in front of the basket, about maybe 7-8 feet. Mm-hmm. I don't know how often you can do that. You know what I mean? But he did it. And Ralph Hacker was the color man on the radio broadcast of Kentucky. And he was kind of like getting into celebratory mood. Mm-hmm. And Cawood calmed him down. and pointed out the game's not over yet. And of course, then the inbounds to Laettner, he makes the shot. Krzyzewski comes to the radio stand there and says some kind words to Kentucky fans who are listening on the radio.
Yeah,
which
I remember that.
was nice. And then I remember hearing, not live, but hearing about that Cawood ended his broadcast by quoting the poet John Greenleaf Whittier, that about the saddest words of pen and tongue are, "It might have been." And I just thought, man, I wish I could go out. I didn't think it then, but since then, what a classy, great way to bow out, quoting a poet.
Right. Cawood was he was the voice of Kentucky basketball for so many years.
Too.
Right.
He brought an objectivity to it, which I admired. And you could sort of tell, if Kentucky won, that was good. He won, he liked that. But he was a professional broadcaster at the same time.
Right. What do you remember about the game besides the obvious Laettner shot? Is there just things that, as the game unfolded, did you realize you were watching what became known as the greatest game in college basketball?
Not as well as I wish I had. I mean, it was obviously a riveting game, and, it held your attention, and, it was rich with storyline possibilities. But, my instinct, especially then, was, and it continued, was not to overdo it. I tried to stay within certain bounds, and I've second-guessed that many times as I've reflected on that game. I wish I had gone overboard. And I remember it was in Philadelphia, and the next morning at the Philadelphia airport, we're going to fly back, and I'm reading like the Philly paper, and and they went full tilt on what a historic, and I'm kicking myself, saying, man, I wish I had gone more towards, just let myself be overwhelmed in the story.
It's interesting that you still think that all these years later. It's like you're still thinking about the work that you did,
Well, that's kind of my nature. I had my last sports editor in Huntington was a guy named Mike Connell, and he was like an assistant city editor. He didn't want to be sports editor, but they made him sports editor. They needed a sports editor. They made him, and he covered it as news. And I remember one of the things is he said several things that stuck with me, but one of them was you reach a certain plateau in your development when you can improve your story each time you read it. And it took me a long time, probably too long, to get to that. But that's kind of my nature, or was, that each time I read it, I could improve it. And the Laettner game was one that I wished I had reread several times, but it's gone now.
Well, Laettner makes the shot, and you mentioned Rick Pitino, and people debate about should you have guarded the inbounds? We can talk that all night, but the fact of the matter is Kentucky's not there without Pitino. He rebuilt that program, and that 8 years that he was there were just. It struck me looking back that he was the right guy at the right place at the right time. Do you agree with that, and why do you think so?
Oh, absolutely. He was, he'd been around the block. He knew what he was doing. He wasn't some guy learning. And I think his personality, he could handle being the Kentucky coach.
What do you mean by that, Jerry?
Well, John Calipari says it's like wearing a big, heavy winter coat all the time, meaning you get noticed wherever you go. You're a celebrity. Billy Gillespie was not comfortable with that, being a celebrity. He just wanted to be a coach. But at Kentucky, you're the coach. Everything you do is subject to being second-guessed, as you know. And every double dribble is going to be examined for what went wrong. Why did the coach let that happen? And you have to have a strong personality to do that. And Rick Pitino's first year, to me, in all of my 41 years, stands out because their record was 14-14, which by Kentucky standards is awful.
Right.
And the fans were overjoyed. They were absolutely thrilled. They had fun. It wasn't about conquering the Washington Generals. It was purely about fun.
And that's because they were on probation, and the program was devastated, by the rules breaking and the punishment. Yeah,
most of the good players transferred.
Right,
the better players transferred, and so there was zero expectation. They were not even, they were nothing. They weren't Kentucky, and the fans loved the style, the running, pressing. There was constant action, and the three-point shot. So there was a thrill likely to happen again and again and again. And if I remember right, that first year they beat LSU at home, and LSU had Chris Jackson, as he was known then, an all-SEC player. He might have been player of the year. Shaquille O'Neal and Stanley Roberts. They were NCAA tournament winning it good. Mm-hmm. Kentucky beat them here. Just because I think their style contributed to that. It was so different back then to shoot so many threes, and they weren't going to let it be a half-court game where the superior talent prevails. They were going to make it up and down, run, and of course they were used to that. That was the way they played. The other teams usually weren't, and that whole season was exceptional. Pitino was very entertaining himself in his own way, totally different from what Kentucky fans were used to, as far as being out there, I think, personality-wise. And they just were thrilled, absolutely thrilled. And it was interesting that once he went to the Celtics after he left Kentucky, and then he goes to Louisville, and he becomes the prime villain.
Right. That's still amazing.
180 degrees the other way, which is interesting.
Right. His intensity never seemed to waver. What was he like to cover as a beat reporter?
Things changed with him because until then, with Joe B. Hall and then Eddie Sutton, practices were open to the media. You could go to practices, talk to whoever you wanted to after the game or after the practice, as long as they were, didn't have class or whatever to go to. Right. Talk to a coach. It was much more informal. I remember with Eddie Sutton, one Thanksgiving, I wasn't married yet. I had nothing to do. They practiced 3 times that day. I went to all 3 practices just for something to do. And, maybe I could pick up something. Who knows?
Right.
But with Pitino, it changed. It became more of the media was here and the coach and the program were there. And the interaction was more controlled at that point. And but he was on. I remember they did a scrimmage. And as I remember, it was the coaches and maybe like people in the program against the media at a high school in Lexington. And Rock Oliver guarded me. He was the strength coach. And I remember hearing that whoever Rock Oliver guarded, that was the guy they were going to shut down. Draw your own conclusions.
Well, how did you do, Jerry?
I got shut down. I think I maybe took 1 or 2 shots and missed them both. And he didn't have to guard me, but he guarded me. And but I wondered. I don't remember asking, but I wondered if that was a way to kind of introduce the media to the style of play. If I remember right, they pressed and shot threes. Tubby Smith had like 36 points.
Wow!
In that whatever you want to call it. I started to say scrimmage, but that's probably
no. You guys were the Washington Generals that you talk about.
Definitely.
We talked a lot here about the '92 team that brought Kentucky back from the ashes of probation. The centerpiece of that team was Jamal Mashburn. What made Mashburn special?
Well, I remember in my farewell thing I wrote that hearing coaches say the difference between good players and great players is the great player makes his teammates better. And that's what Mashburn was. And I remember the first time I saw him, it was a high school all-star game in Louisville. And, of course, we knew he was coming to Kentucky. And here's this guy, 6'8", and he was a little heavy then. He was too heavy, really. And I bet he was 240 or 250. And you see this big body with guard skills. The way he played was like 6 foot, 180, but in a 6'8", 250 body.
Right.
So he had both things going, skill and muscle. If it wasn't really muscle.
At the time,
in there too. And I remember they played a scrimmage, a preseason scrimmage. Back then, they went around the state and played 2 or 3 inter-squad scrimmages. And, of course, the fans in those areas were really jacked up. They were really excited. And in one of them, it might have been the first one, we talked to Rick Pitino afterwards, and he says Jamal Mashburn's going to be I think he said he may have said the best players in Kentucky history. That gets your attention.
Right.
That makes you, whoa, wait a minute. Did he say what I think he just said? And I think that one of the best would fit.
Right, definitely.
Think. And he, like I say, I remember noticing and going into his second year, his body was sculpted now. And he was a different person. I think that was 91, 92, the Laettner. Yes, That was the Laettner year. And he was, he still was big, 6'8", and he could still do things that big guys could do.
Right. Well, Rock Oliver had to give up time from shutting you down to go work with Mashburn.
Yeah, that was a sacrifice for Rock. That's a good point. But he was, a nice guy. He didn't seem to be consumed with his celebrity. And I remember it was before a game, either his second or third year at home game, and they mispronounced his name. And the PA guy, and I happened to be standing near him, and he just kind of smiled. It wasn't like, hey, I'm Jamal Mashburn. You got to get my name right. And I was impressed by that.
Well, it says a lot about him and his talent and his personality. What other players come to mind when you think about all the years that you covered? You covered so many great players, but are there ones that you just enjoyed either covering or watching play?
Well, there's all sorts of, we could take up the whole show just talking about players that made a lasting memory. Another guy that comes to mind for me is Tyler Eulis. And he was 5'8", I think. And, it's kind of a David and Goliath kind of storyline. And he was just so smart. And that appeals to me. The power and all of that, I get it. It's part of the game. The athleticism, I get it. It's part of the game and is valuable. But intelligence is something that appeals to me, a smart player. And I remember they went to the Bahamas the summer before his freshman year, played, I think it was 6 exhibition games in 8 days. Wow. And everyone, including me, was exhausted because it was just like, just being away for 8 or 9 days would, be consuming. But they played 6 games. And I remember noticing he was the smartest player on the court. This is a freshman that hasn't played a college game yet. And he was like a point guard. And he would take the outlet pass would come to him. And again, he would almost throw touch passes down the court to a teammate for a fast break layup. He saw he saw the whole court. He knew where everyone was. A freshman. I was just, really blown away by this. John Calipari's had a lot of great point guards. But if you compare the numbers of each one, John Wall, I'm trying to remember them all, Ashton Hagans, Brandon Knight, all sorts of guys, Eulis's numbers dwarf all of them. It's not even close. And, I just loved watching him play. And the other thing that jumped out at me was of course, the other teams would try to post him up because he was only 5'8", and thin, and he wasn't having it. He was contesting for that spot at the post. You weren't going to just get it and just post him up. He was going to make you work to get the spot on the post you wanted. There was all sorts of guys. I mean, Kenny Walker, Sam Bowie. My first 2 years on the beat were the 2 years Sam Bowie sat out. He had a stress fracture in his lower leg, I think left leg. And, of course, I was aware that Sam Bowie was really good, a 7-footer or close to it. And I remember he didn't play at all. And then the second year, they had a practice, and he practiced. and in a scrimmage kind of thing, and I wanted to see him. I mean, I'd been hearing about and writing about this guy that's not playing. I wanted to see him play in person. And he was the best player on the floor. And he hadn't played in a year and a half or whatever it was. And he still wasn't able to play in games. He didn't play in a game that season. But he played in this one scrimmage, best player on the court. And I wonder, maybe they would have won a national championship in either my first or second year, or both, if he had been playing.
Oh, they'll just blame you for not winning it, though. You know, it's Tipton. It's that new guy. It's that bowling writer from West Virginia.
I don't want to say who, but somebody, another, let's say, media person was mocking me, and that's what he said. He said that I used to be a bowling writer, and I thought, I was.
Set him up and I'll knock him down.
There's no shame in that. You know, I know what a 7-10 split is. Okay.
Well, you mentioned several of the coaches, and you covered 6 of them. The first one was Joe Hall. And when you think about how, Pitino and John Calipari are, they're just so out there, big personalities. And that's kind of what I think of as Kentucky basketball in this era of the last 30 years. But Joe Hall was a much different type of character, right? I mean, that was well, you tell us.
Well, the first thing to think of is that he was from Kentucky. Mm-hmm. And he grew, I think, Cynthiana, if I remember, which is about maybe an hour north of Lexington. And he was a Kentucky fan. So, the way we talk about Kentucky fans being consumed with Kentucky basketball, that was Joe B. Hall. He cared to the max. And so now he's the coach. He's getting second-guessed. There's all this pressure. And among the people second-guessing him was Adolph Rupp. Adolph Rupp, the icon. And so any second-guessing he does hits home. You know, this is like God second-guessing you.
Rupp retired, and they made him retire in like 72, I think, and he kept an office down the hall from Joe.
He kept an office, and he kept doing I don't know if it was radio or TV show. Weekly TV show. And on the show, he second-guessed Joe B. Hall. I wasn't here then. This is what I've been told by people that knew, that were here. I think it's, as you would agree, it's hard enough following a legend as the coach, but to have the legend second-guessing you publicly, from what I'm told, the Kentucky fandom was split. There were some people that thought Rupp was not treated fairly and he should still be the coach. And there were some people that were rooting for Joe B. Hall and wanted Joe B. Hall to succeed because he was the Kentucky coach. So by the time I came in, Coach Adolph Rupp had died, so that part had subsided. But the second-guessing and all of that was still part of it. So any objectivity would almost be a sin. Kentucky's, as you know, Kentucky basketball is an exception to objectivity. That's for everything else. Okay. But Kentucky basketball is so magnificent that if you're objective, then you don't care.
Right.
And
so Joe Hall sees you as a big sinner. Was it a day-to-day battle with Joe B?
Well, I wouldn't say day-to-day, but there were times. It wasn't unusual and we had much more access then. So there was much more of an opportunity for the coach to vent, shall we say. And that happened. And I remember, well, no, that doesn't matter.
Yeah, it does. Come on.
Okay. There was one time they were practicing. Of course, media got to go to practice. They were I don't remember who they were playing, but they were working on a box and one defense. So there was one guy on the other team they wanted to contain. And I remember the SID person came over to us and basically asked us not to report that they worked on the box and one, which I didn't. And as far as I know, no one did. To me, it was like war plans. You don't want to, that's too far. You want to report the news, but not war plans. So maybe I scored a few points there. I doubt it. He called me DA, and not from the start, but it came to, and I was wondering, I naively thought maybe he's saying district attorney. But after some time and reflection, I think he was saying dumbass.
Well, you guys almost came to blows a couple times, right?
Yeah, there was a couple of times where I wondered if the fight wasn't going to last long. It wouldn't take him long to beat me up. One punch, and I would be crying for mother. But one of them had to do with the '84 NCAA tournament. I believe it was the first and second round. It may have been the Sweet 16 Elite Eight. Was in Lexington. And the 4 teams were Kentucky, Louisville, Maryland, and Illinois. And I had the bright idea, sarcasm alert, that maybe I could do something on Joby Hall and Lefty Driesell, 2 coaches who accomplished a lot, yet didn't have, there wasn't universal respect. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I just thought it was interesting that they had both a lot of success, yet, so I approached both of them, and neither one of them warmed up to that idea. And Lefty just sort of dismissed me. And Joe B., there were some other people around, not media people, but just people. And I don't remember what he said, but it was a put down. And it was just, I thought, a little over the line. So I told him, hey, don't say that. He objected to me having the gall to try to, I wouldn't call it scold him, but correct him. And he kind of said something to the effect of, what are you going to do about it?
Wow.
And, what am I going to do about it? Nothing. I'm just going to take it. But, that one stands out in my mind.
Yeah, but years later, when Joe was in retirement, and he passed away in January, God rest his soul, you and Joe would go to lunch, right?
I was told by people that had been around longer than me, somebody like Billy Reed, a columnist at the Courier and at the Herald Leader at different times, that Joe B. was a different person when he was the assistant coach. He was friendly, jovial, smiling. You really had to outgoing. You had to really like him. Then when he became coach, the head coach, he became a different person, much more uptight, much more defensive, but, that sort of thing, because he was under a lot of pressure. And then after he retired, he kind of reverted back to the more friendly, jovial. And when one year with John Calipari, he was coaching the Dominican national team in a summer thing. And he had something going on downtown Lexington. They had a blue carpet outside this restaurant, and people came, and the media could talk to them on their way into this thing. And Joe B. was one of them. And he was the friendly, jovial, laughing, kidding. Everything was great. And one of the younger media people turned to me and said, was Joe B. like that when he was the coach? And I said, no. No, he was not. But I talked to him. I did his obit. It was 100 inches. Wow. And I talked to him maybe 3 years before he passed away and told him what I was doing. And we met. We talked. It went really well. I wrote 100 inches, which is the longest story I've ever written. And I was pretty happy with it, to be honest. I think I hit it right.
Right.
And but at one of the lunches, he asked me, do you realize that someday you're going to have to meet your maker and you're going to have to explain some of those stories you did? and so I kind of smiled. I just thought, it was funny, and I didn't think anything about it. Well, a few minutes later, he said it again. And again, now I'm thinking, I think he wants a response. And then about the third time, he says, hey, I want an answer. He didn't say those words, but and he said, someday you're going to meet your maker and you'll have to explain those stories. So I said, well, Joe, do you realize that maybe God has a special place for sports writers? And he said, He does. He does. He pointed down.
I like the thumbs down. He won't even say hell. He'll just point you down.
He wanted to make sure I got the message.
Oh, man. That's pretty funny.
Yeah, I liked it. I mean, yeah, I didn't, it was what it was.
Well, one of the things I always admired about you, many things I admired about you, Jerry, but, you're unafraid to ask the tough questions. Always objective, always there, trying to get more. And even when things got heated for you, whether it was the fans or the coaches or the officials, whoever, you were always able to shake it off with a sense of humor.
Well, I think, I don't know who said this, but I fully believe it, that laughter and humor is a coping device. And it's a way to deal with the pressure and so on. And I remember a journalism professor back at Marshall when I was a student saying that if the story is about the reporter, that's not good. And I didn't really understand what that meant, but over time, I got it. And so I tried to keep myself out of it as much as possible. You say ask tough questions. I didn't think about it in terms of I'm going to ask a tough question. I just thought about it as asking a pointed question or a pertinent question beyond. Ideally, I would rather have a conversation and we would just talk. But,
right.
That's part of it. You ask questions. And so I just tried to ask good questions. I wasn't thinking of them as I'm backing you up against the wall, buddy. Mm-hmm. I thought that would be injecting myself into it, which I didn't want to do.
Right. Well, then your sense of humor could bond with somebody like Calipari, who also seems to have a sense of humor, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think maybe that's a coping device for him, too. Could very well be.
Well, everybody needs a coping device when you're dealing with the pressure and the intense heat of Kentucky basketball, and nobody, from a reporter's standpoint, did it as well as you did, Jerry. And I really count my blessings. You, in all honesty, had a really big impact on my life. As a college student, it really opened my eyes to doing what I wanted to do, but doing it in a way that I learned how was the right way to do. And that was to be objective and to be a reporter and not a fan.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I just think being objective leads to better stories. Mm-hmm. If a fan, that's kind of, to me, that's okay. There's a place for that, certainly, for the fans. And I hope, I want them to be fans. That year with COVID where there weren't as many fans in the stands, that wasn't much fun. I would rather they be there and scream, and if they want to yell at me, that's fine, which they don't. I can't think of hardly any instances of that. But I just think, as I tell people, when I'm writing, when I'm asking questions, I'm thinking, what question might a reader have? As I'm doing this story, the coach says X. Well, I'm thinking, well, if I'm a reader, I want to know, maybe I want to put X in perspective, or there's an obvious hypothetical question that comes to mind dealing with X. That's the point, is to try to do a better story. It's not to hope Kentucky loses or anything like that. My rooting interests from the start have been pro teams. That's where I was emotionally involved. But as you know, especially now with social media and the internet, you're constantly on deadline. There's no time for the rooting. The only thing I'm rooting for is a good storyline to come to mind.
Well, we certainly enjoyed having you on the show, Jerry. It's been a lot of fun. Once again, I thank you for your friendship and your guidance, your wisdom. You took me under your wing at a young age, and so many years I thought, what would Jerry do here? What would Jerry ask?
Well, I have, that's a high compliment. And I have my sports writing heroes too, and you've had several of them on your show. So, that was enriching for me.
So, well, thanks a lot, Jerry. Really appreciate it. And I wish you the best in retirement. Now, go hit the couch or run some errands for your wonderful wife, Paula.
I'll definitely do that.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jerry. Thanks for listening to Press Box Access. You can find us here with a new episode every other Wednesday. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe, follow us on Apple Podcasts, or on your favorite podcast app. We'd love for you to review us. 5 stars would be nice. Follow us on social media. drop us an email at pressboxaccess@gmail.com. And be sure to spread the word. Everyone is welcome here. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcast. A special thank you to executive producers Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando, producer Bill Huffman, and our audio engineer Nathan Corson. I'm your host, Todd Jones. It's closing time. Rock on.
Hi, podcast listeners. I'm Carol Costello, a former CNN anchor and national correspondent. This January, I'm launching a podcast about one of the first cases I ever covered as a journalist. It's one that stuck with me all of these years, the one that buried itself under my skin and stayed put. It's a true crime series about an amazing woman named Phyllis Cottle, who defied torture and death and brought a fierce rage to the quest to find her attacker. Carol Costello presents Blind Rage. It's a production of Evergreen Podcasts and signature title of the Killer Podcast Network. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Discover more great true crime and paranormal programming at killerpodcast.com.